And now I'd like to invite and introduce Ms. Marcella Turner Cmuchal, who is Project Manager for I-Access and ICT for Information Accessibility in Learning in the European Agency for Development in Special Needs Education. Mrs. Turner Cmuchal will give us a presentation about the ICT for Information Accessibility in Learning. Hello.
So, while the presentation is uploading, thank you, and it works fine. I'd like to thank the organizers for this learning opportunity today, and especially for the translation, which makes it an inclusive experience, also for me as only English speaker. So, thank you for giving me a voice in Polish to the translators and in sign language to you as well, and helping me participate in this event. I'll try to repay you by speaking slowly. So I have agreement. The translators will wave, and you can tip me on the shoulder if I get carried away. So we've already heard a bit about the digital divide, which my colleague Amanda has already spoken about, and how people with disabilities are at a risk of being doubly disadvantaged if their access to appropriate ICT is not supported. So we've already said this, but I'd also like to formulate this in a positive way. Technology can enable their participation and achievement and their contribution to learning as a whole. And as we believe this, there's two projects I'd like to introduce to you, which my colleague Amanda Watkins has mentioned briefly. One is accessible information provision for lifelong learning. The other is ICT for information accessibility for learning. Now, the agency has a tendency for long names. Our name, my personal name, but also the names of our projects. So I'll try to be a bit shorter and use the acronyms I-Access and ICT for IAL for these two projects. The I-Access project, and I've included just the logo of this project on this slide, was a one-year project which went from 2011 to 2012, was supported by the European Commission under the Lifelong Learning Project, and involved experts from 21 agency member countries, and I was glad to see that also our expert from Poland is here today. With 21 experts from all over Europe, we looked into the accessibility of information. So we've spoken a bit today about ICT, about hardware and software, but we're actually looking at the actual information that we try to convey in learning. So it's not just about technology, but how we actually use this technology. The goal of the project was to raise awareness for this issue that we're discussing today, and also develop recommendations for accessibility policy, so aimed at policymakers. But the experts said, to do this, we need to first agree what are the actual guiding principles who have to underlie all of these recommendations for policy. So I'd like to introduce these 4 principles to you, and you might recognize some of them from other presentations during the day. The first is the rights principle. That is the principle that learners have the right to accessible information. The structural principle is that any policy or recommendation shouldn't regard technology as an end in itself. So we've also heard this today. It's about how do we use technology. It's not enough to just have it, but how do we use it to support our teaching. The third is the all-inclusive principle. that accessible information provision needs to be considered in its widest interpretation, so to include all people with disabilities, with special needs, with or without these labels. And the last is the synergy principle, and that is that accessibility benefits all users, so with disabilities and or special needs. And we've also heard this presented in our talk from our director, Mr. Kormeyer, and there it was formulated by the students themselves to say that inclusion benefits all. And to take it a bit from this descriptive level, just to give you an example, in our everyday life, there was a method or a tool, the voice control of devices. This was developed for people with special needs, but I'm sure within this audience there are quite a few who are already relying on the voice control of their iPhones, for instance, or might try it out on other devices. Or another one is the audio version of books. It's just an alternative way of providing the same information in a way that can be used. When we agreed these guiding principles as a basis, as a next step we developed recommendations for policymakers, what they should consider. We've, in this project, considered for each of these recommendations, there's 7, which I'll just introduce briefly. What can be done at a European, at a national, and also at an organizational level. In an organizational level, we include all organizations that are responsible for providing information for learning. And we ourselves, the agency, include us in this group. So just to introduce these, and again, you may recognize some of these recommendations from earlier presentations, and also the results from the ICT for Inclusion project. But we believe it's worth repeating them because it shows that across our projects, we've got these universal recurring themes of what's important to make things work. So the first one is raising awareness about accessible information being a right. All stakeholders, students themselves, their family and support services, they should know that they actually have a right to having accessible information. A multi-stakeholder approach, and we also heard the minister speaking of this morning, trying to get the different ministries together, because inclusive education as well as the accessibility of information is an issue across different policy areas, and there's many different stakeholders that should be involved. Issues around accessible information provision should also be a part of the education of professionals involved in lifelong learning. So there again, not just for them to be able to use ICT, to be able to use a specific software, but also to really get some input on how can I use software to support specific students, but also to use it to make my teaching even more effective than it might be already. The fourth issue is that, and this has been touched upon as well before, it's not just relevant for the education of teachers, teacher educators, but also for ICT and media professionals. Everything which appears in the news, which appears in magazines, that's also a part of learning, of how we learn also as adults. So accessibility doesn't remain an issue just for this formal learning environment, but also ICT developers. They should know, how do I provide my information in an accessible way? How do I create programs which have universal design and are already rather accessible? The fifth recommendation was that accessibility should be a guiding principle for procurement. So meaning whenever a ministry or another organization, if they have this in their policy, that means that anything they buy has the requirement of already being an accessible tool or an accessible hardware. And we see this from examples of the United States, where there really, very long ago already, there's been an Accessibility Act, meaning that schools are only allowed to buy accessible tools and soft and hardware. As a result, many large companies such as Microsoft, Adobe, Mac users, Apple, as well as HP, they've been forced to think about the accessibility of their products. So it's quite a strong instrument to have this included in policy. The sixth recommendation, and also the seventh, maybe I'll take these together. One is research should be promoted in order to develop an evidence base for future policy design, implementation, and evaluation. And Amanda's spoken about this before me. And also how to check compliance to policy, to monitor this, and to see where am I actually on the way to where I would like to be. This was just really brief, but I know it's a lot of information today, so I just wanted to give you the headlines. And if this is information you think is useful for you, then we'll be including the links in our presentations, and you're welcome to access the information. You can download it free and also in your own language. So I've included the link to the project web area where all the information is. And in addition to the recommendations, you will find the report on the conference. You will also find a collection of examples of practice, a glossary of terms, because we use so often things like accessibility, assistive technology, and there we've given a few definitions what we actually mean by this. And you'll also find a list of some resources that already exist that maybe you find useful. Within our work of iAccess, and I'm using an image here that I'll describe verbally, we said these key areas and recommendations that we develop are aimed at policymakers, but we'd like to have them considered at a European, national, and organizational level, as I've mentioned before. The recommendations are basically saying, what should we do? And we know we have a lot of different policy on European level, on national level, sometimes different regional levels. But maybe what we're missing is, okay, we know what to do, but how do we do it? So our next step was to work on a project where we're actually collecting information, also on existing resources, on how to do this, how to provide accessible information for learning. And we're developing guidelines aimed at practitioners, and we're looking at these from an organizational level, but also for the individual learner. And the name of this project is the ICT for Information and Accessibility in Learning project, ICT for IAL. This is a bit of a different project for the agency because we're not working on this, organizing it on our own, but it's a network of partners who are in themselves networks. And we're working today together with the DAISY Consortium, which is working on the DAISY format, which is a accessibility supporting format used in e-publications. We're working with European SchoolNet, and you will hear a presentation from them as well. The Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, which is a flagship of UNESCO, working specifically on inclusive ICTs. The International Association of Universities, as well as UNESCO. This is now a 3-year project. It's also co-funded by the European Commission. And of course, in addition to these organizations, we're working again with national experts. And I don't see her at the moment, but before it was Malena Plebanska who was speaking, who was also participating in our workshop that we had to develop the guidelines. Within this project, we've got some specific objectives. The general aims are to raise awareness on this issue and also to develop guidelines. The way we go about this is to have a knowledge exchange and a networking across Europe, but also beyond Europe, on the issue of accessible information for learning. We're developing the guidelines, which is where we are now at this stage. And as a next step, we always are really quick on saying this is what you should do and maybe even how you should do it. But we plan to try what we actually suggest. So 3 of the organizations, the International Association of Universities, European SchoolNet, and the Agency, will actually be trying the guidelines within our work. And the experience that we have, we will use to make them better, and also to supply a bit of information on what does it mean for an organization or for an individual if you want to make your information accessible, what processes are involved. So that is also our validation. We'll also feed back what we have to our experts. And as a last step, when we're all very happy with what we have, we'll be disseminating this information, and it will be available for you as well. For the guidelines, we will be looking at information. And with information, we're looking at different elements of information. So information can be text, video, image, or audio. How it's rendered or how it's delivered is often a mix of all these elements. But how these single elements are made accessible, there's often things that work across the different elements, like the structuring of information. And so we'll be looking also at these mixed elements, of course, web-based accessibility, and also print materials, because it's still a reality. Not every school is working just with digital information. And we've received in the previous presentations already some examples, actually looking at the e-handbook and how this can be done in an accessible way, and this will also be included in our guidelines. For each of these elements that I've just mentioned, so text, video, image, and audio, we'll be answering a few questions. What are the main challenges in making this accessible? What is needed for this element? And what resources, especially existing resources, do we have, and where are they? Where can we access those to make the information accessible? And last but not least, we would like to provide you with exemplars, a document or a link or something where you can see this is actually how it works, this is what it would look like. So this is work in progress. In the next year is our implementation phase. So this is where we will be looking at our outputs and how they are provided in an accessible way. And the news on progress will of course be shared on our website. So thank you for your attention around lunchtime. No, that's not easy. I've just included the link to our website, which is www.european-agency.org, but you're also welcome to email my colleagues or myself.